At dawn, the farmer discovers mysterious realtors on his land, poised to dismantle his lifelong work. A humble family finds itself at the epicenter of ruthless schemes threatening to seize every inch of their fertile soil. Corruption reaches the highest levels of power, prompting the farmer to send a desperate email to the Vice President of the United States. Within mere days, the realtors planned to formally seize the farm, relying on their powerful connections. Suddenly, the roar of engines echoes over the fields as the presidential aircraft lands. Stepping off the plane, J.D. Vance shatters the wrongdoers' schemes with his mere presence, displaying unwavering resolve. His legal team swiftly uncovers the illegal operations, foreshadowing a high-profile scandal. The realtors are stripped of all licenses, and their assets are confiscated in favor of the wronged landowner. Locals witness that even the most powerful scammers cannot escape justice. The farm is saved, and its story becomes a symbol of integrity triumphing over greed. Stay with us if you want to find out how the story ends, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because many more intriguing plots await you. He stood at the edge of his field long before the sun rose, silently taking in the gentle slope of the land that had sustained his family for generations. The man felt the soil beneath his boots, slightly damp from the early morning dew, and remembered the countless harvests that had come and gone. The soft hum of distant insects reminded him of the nights he had spent working by moonlight, desperate to ensure that not a single row of seedlings would wither on his watch. Each passing season left its imprint upon him, yet he remained steadfast. The farm had become the physical embodiment of his family's history, an anchor of tradition, resilience, and perseverance. He tried to steady his breathing as the weight of unwanted change pressed into his consciousness. Uncertainty loomed, and despite the gentle, familiar rhythms of the farm, there was a sense of impending crisis he could neither shake nor ignore. His neighbors often admired his dedication. They would watch him methodically inspect the soil, consult his late father's battered ledger, and check for early signs of disease or pests. They saw the devotion in his tired eyes whenever he would pause to honor the memories woven into every corner of the farm. This land was not merely an asset or a piece of property. It was a testament to the hopes and dreams of all those who had come before him. It carried the footprints of his forebears and retained the echoes of celebrations held after bountiful harvests. Generations had toiled here, weathering drought, floods, and lean years. Yet through all the hardships, the farm survived and even thrived, providing enough to sustain the family and share with those in need. Over time, prosperity in the surrounding county brought new developments, roads, and subdivisions. Large commercial enterprises discovered the scenic vistas, and real estate speculators grew hungry for fresh opportunities. Property taxes rose, infrastructure expanded, and curious passers-by began to show interest in parcels of farmland that had once been dismissed as too remote or difficult to cultivate. The area experienced a shift in perspective. Land was no longer treasured simply for agricultural worth, it became an investment, a commodity to be purchased and subdivided. Rumors floated around that certain unscrupulous developers were forging convenient alliances, gaining influence over local officials, and bending regulations in ways that suited their wallets. Initially, the farmer paid little attention to the whispered stories of shady deals. He believed that justice would ultimately prevail, and that a long-standing, proud family tradition would not fall victim to corporate greed. He could not conceive of a scenario in which rightful owners, working hard and living by honest means, might lose their ancestral home. Yet as days gave way to months, he began to sense subtle changes. The usually supportive county clerk grew distant and curt in conversation. Notices about zoning or land assessments started arriving more frequently, each with cryptic demands and burdensome fees. When he tried to seek help or clarification, the offices seemed perpetually understaffed or unresponsive. Every path of inquiry ended in polite but firm refusals to assist him. Each letter he received hinted at financial penalties looming over him if he failed to comply with newly minted regulations. Then came the day he found strangers surveying his property without permission. They carried instruments and scribbled notes, regarding the land with the cold calculation of outsiders who saw only acreage and profit potential. He confronted them gently, hoping an explanation would dispel his fears, but their smiles were superficial, and they barely concealed a sense of entitlement. They identified themselves as agents representing a realty conglomerate, though no official identification was presented to him. They left with a vague promise of returning soon, leaving the farmer more unsettled than ever. He began to suspect that the rumors of widespread corruption were no exaggeration. The field he cherished, with its neat rows of corn and bean plants waving in the breeze, had become a target. The challenges multiplied in a dizzying avalanche of bureaucracy. Letters marked with official seals started to show up almost daily. They threatened liens, foreclosure proceedings, and costly legal battles if certain payments were not made swiftly. Conflicting instructions from various municipal departments made it impossible to determine what was required to keep the farm in compliance. At times, the notices contained contradictory demands, each one carrying a dire consequence for noncompliance. Feeling harassed and overwhelmed, the farmer spent his evenings poring over legal documents he barely understood. He consulted neighbors and acquaintances in the hope someone might have a lead on a decent lawyer who could stand up to the realty group and the local authorities. But every professional he approached seemed reluctant to take on such a formidable opponent. Some warned him that the group wielded influence at the courthouse, others cited scheduling conflicts. One or two hinted that they feared professional and personal retribution if they intervened on behalf of an ordinary farmer. Financial strain mounted as he attempted to keep up with the spiking property taxes and sudden fees. Crops that year had not yielded as abundantly, further stressing his resources. Creditors began to knock on his door, reminding him that banks tended to lose patience quickly. The farmer did his best to reason with them, describing the cyclical nature of agriculture and how a more favorable season could restore his solvency. Yet those words did little to calm the tension, and it seemed as though every voice in his life was pushing him toward the conclusion that he was fighting a lost cause. He would lie awake at night, haunted by the image of bulldozers tearing apart the fields where he had labored side by side with his father. The concept of losing the place that held so many years of family history was both unthinkable and terrifying. He struggled to remain optimistic, to muster the resilience that generations before him had shown in times of trouble. He believed deeply in the dignity of honest work and the power of goodwill among neighbors. Yet there were moments he felt completely alone, as though an invisible hand had orchestrated a campaign to deprive him of support. In the darkest stretch of one such night, he decided he had to reach beyond the usual channels and attempt something that, under ordinary circumstances, would have seemed inconceivable. Despite his limited connections and the immense power he sensed behind these aggressive real estate forces, he placed his faith in the faint hope that someone in a position of national authority might care enough to intervene. He had read news reports that the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, was known for championing ordinary people caught in extraordinary difficulties. The farmer had never considered writing to a high-ranking official before. Part of him suspected that a letter addressed to the Vice President would be lost in a shuffle of countless petitions. But with desperation creeping in, he resolved to try. Late one evening, he sat at his cluttered kitchen table and composed a heartfelt email, carefully explaining how the realtors had systematically chipped away at every support structure he once relied upon. He described the heritage of the farm, the personal nature of his struggle, and how he feared not only for his own livelihood but for the broader principle of fairness that should protect citizens from such injustices. Upon hitting send, he felt an odd mixture of relief and apprehension. He did not dare to harbor great expectations, yet at least he had done something. The following days brought further complications, further demands, and more pressure from the realty group's intimidating representatives. When local officials made thinly veiled suggestions that the land might be seized in lieu of certain debts, the farmer realized that time was running out. He had not received any reply from the vice president's office. Unable to imagine how such a crisis could be resolved, he found himself standing again at the edge of his field, reflecting on what might become of everything he held dear. He nearly surrendered to the notion that it was only a matter of time before the land was no longer his. Meanwhile, in the corridors of power that the farmer could barely fathom, J.D. Vance's staff discreetly sorted through a mountain of correspondence. Although the farmer had no knowledge of what happened behind the scenes, something in his plea resonated with someone on the vice president's team. Due to the volume of messages that arrived daily, the farmer's note was not read immediately. However, in time, a diligent aide noted the sincerity and the alarming nature of the allegations. Though the farmer remained unaware of this development, his message reached the eyes of an individual who recognized that the situation hinted at a deep-rooted corruption, potentially emblematic of larger systemic problems. Life on the farm turned increasingly bleak. Realty agents circled like vultures, arriving at irregular intervals and taking more measurements. One day, they came equipped with official documents, as though preparing for an imminent seizure of the property. They refused to offer details, politely stating that the process would move forward in due course, as though it were a mere formality. The farmer's heart pounded with dread every time he saw their vehicles kick up dust along the winding path that led to his home. It was the path he had walked down to meet the school bus as a child, the same path along which his parents had driven a battered truck to bring in the harvest. Now it looked like a conveyor belt of unstoppable greed. His phone calls to local representatives yielded nothing but hollow assurances that the matter was under review. These were always followed by reminders of potential fees for missing certain deadlines. He continued to check his email every evening, yet no reply came from the vice president's office. Days turned into a week, and his hope waned. The realtors began talking more openly about their plans, letting slip comments that indicated they were only waiting for the final rubber stamp from the county. They had contacts, they boasted among themselves, who could expedite the paperwork. The farmer dared to visit the local courthouse, carrying a binder stuffed with every piece of documentation he had collected. After an exhausting wait in the corridor, a weary clerk indicated that his hearing date was set for a time that might be too late to stop the foreclosure process. The clerk apologized in a perfunctory manner, noting that the docket was jammed. The farmer asked whether a quicker date might be arranged, but the clerk stared back with an expression that was equal parts sympathy and resignation, as though to say that powerful interests could not be easily overturned. She scribbled a note on a slip of paper and slid it across the counter, leaving him with an official date that filled him with dread. When he returned to the farm that evening, he scanned the property as though seeing it for the last time. He lingered by the barn, recalling the laughter of children, the warmth of holiday gatherings, and the ceaseless cycle of seasons. Every inch of this land carried a memory. He ran his hand along the weathered wood, thinking about the times his family had built new additions, hammered nails in the sweltering summer heat, and painted the walls while birds chirped overhead. The thought that it could all be taken away by a group of unknown people in suits felt profoundly wrong. All he could do was keep going, one day at a time, helplessly watching a crisis unfold. Sometimes he stood in the dim light of his kitchen, imagining a scenario in which Vice President Vance personally intervened. It was a fantasy that he could scarcely cling to. Then, without warning, the final blow arrived. The realtors informed him that they would be returning in a matter of days with official personnel to finalize the necessary paperwork. Their approach carried a forced politeness, each word saturated with confidence in their ability to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. They left him with no illusions. He would be expected to vacate shortly thereafter, or face being removed. That night, for the first time, the farmer abandoned his usual kitchen table vigil. He simply sat on the porch, gazing up at the stars, feeling more alone than he ever had in his life. There, in the silence of the late hour, he acknowledged the possibility that all his memories might be relegated to a painful recollection, overshadowed by a future in which the farm no longer existed as he knew it. Still, he could not entirely extinguish a faint spark of defiance. He resolved that he would not leave peacefully. Something deep within him, passed down through his family's lineage, told him that surrender was not an option. If that meant continuing to fight in the courts, so be it. But he also knew the harsh reality of his resources, time, money, and public sympathy were in short supply. The community that once would have rallied behind him now seemed to keep its distance, perhaps fearing entanglement in a conflict with powerful entities. 2 days later, the farmer woke to a dawn that felt suffocatingly heavy. He prepared himself mentally for the arrival of the realtors and whoever else they would bring along to solidify their claim. In an effort to steel his nerves, he took one last pass through the fields, gently touching the leaves of each crop row that had sprouted despite the adversity of the season. The sky grew brighter, and the day stretched on, each hour burdened by tension. He heard vehicles approaching in the distance. Soon, the dreaded moment would be upon him. What he did not know was that elsewhere, gears were turning that might alter his fate. The vice president, J.D. Vance, had finally been made aware of the farmer's dilemma. In a fortuitous turn of events, the information about the corrupted practices of certain real estate firms aligned with other complaints that had reached the federal level. Staffers discovered a pattern of intimidation and possible collusion with local officials. The farmer's desperate appeal served as a catalyst, prompting a deeper inquiry. An undercurrent of determination emerged in the higher offices of government, even as the farmer braced himself for the impending confrontation. By late morning on that fateful day, the realtors' cars ascended the gravel path leading to the homestead, leaving behind spirals of dust in the humid air. They arrived with briefcases and documents, accompanied by a small entourage that seemed to include a local official or two. The farmer stood near his porch, a silent witness to what felt like the final chapter in a long, grueling saga. Tension radiated through the atmosphere, and in that moment, even the breeze across the field seemed to pause. He saw them step out of their vehicles, their expressions charged with a complacent air of inevitability. They gathered in a tight group, tapping on electronic tablets, marking forms that indicated their readiness to seize a piece of his family's heritage. The farmer swallowed hard, trying to muster what remained of his fortitude. With each step they took toward him, the magnitude of the confrontation increased. He felt the anguish of letting down all who came before him, as though he were the last in a proud line that had weathered so many storms. In the quiet recesses of his mind, he pleaded for a miracle. His heart pounded as the group drew near. There, on the cusp of having his life's foundation torn away, he clung to the slimmest possibility. He remembered his midnight email and forced himself not to dismiss the notion that extraordinary help might descend at the final hour. The realtors began distributing papers, explaining they would verify everything with the county clerk's office. From the corner of his eye, the farmer noticed something in the sky. At first, it was just a faint roar, barely distinguishable from the usual sounds of the day. But it grew louder, causing heads to turn skyward. As the sound intensified, the farmer became aware that something truly unexpected was happening, and he felt an unspoken glimmer of hope surge in his chest. He did not yet know how events would unfold, but a sense of impending change, profound and dramatic, electrified the air. Then he saw the unfamiliar aircraft, a symbol of rank and authority, descending toward his fields. He could only stand in astonishment, his life hanging in the balance, as it touched down on the open land that had shaped so many of his memories. He did not yet comprehend what this arrival would mean for his struggles, but in that electric moment, he realized that the impossible might just have become possible. He blinked, the dust swirling around him, trying to steady his breath and fully absorb the sight of the gleaming transport bearing all the hallmarks of a presidential visit. Though he could not see who disembarked, he sensed that this was no mere formality. Something extraordinary was about to unfold, bringing with it the potential for redemption, justice, and a final stand against those who had come to take what was not rightfully theirs. A hush settled over the fields as the aircraft's landing gear touched the ground, stirring clouds of dust that rolled across the farmland. The powerful engines roared, then gradually powered down, leaving behind an uncanny stillness that held everyone's breath captive. The farmer stood rooted to the spot, torn between astonishment and an unspoken sense of anticipation. He could make out the distinct markings identifying this as a high-level government plane, but he did not trust his own eyes. It seemed inconceivable that such a massive display of authority would arrive on his humble property, especially on the very day he feared his family's legacy would be taken from him. The realtors, startled by the spectacle, began to murmur among themselves. Some instinctively held their folders closer, as though this sudden intervention might expose the questionable transactions hidden in those documents. The farmer watched them exchange uneasy glances, each clearly wondering how to adapt their well-rehearsed procedures to the unimaginable scenario unfolding before them. The local officials who had accompanied the realtors stood stock-still, their expressions a mix of confusion and guarded worry. At first, there was a faint glimmer of hope in their eyes, perhaps believing that the arrival of such a delegation would validate their authority. But as the plane's door opened, revealing the unmistakable figure of the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, it became painfully clear that the power dynamic was about to shift. Despite the lingering dust and the dull roar that still emanated from the aircraft, the Vice President's presence on the farm felt larger than life. He descended from the plane with a calm, purposeful stride, flanked by a small team of advisors and security. His gaze swept across the scene, taking in the farmer's stoic stance and the realtor's abruptly stiffened composure. No one spoke, but it seemed as though every breath in that field was collectively held, waiting for some signal or acknowledgement that would define what came next. In the distance, a few neighbors and curious passers-by rushed to fence lines, drawn by the sound of engines and the spectacular sight of a high-ranking government official landing in their remote community. Whispers circulated quickly among them, speculation about corruption in the county, rumors of the farmers' legal battles, and the extraordinary possibility that the second-highest office in the nation had come to set things right. For a moment, the tension and confusion hung like a cloud over the farmland, tangible enough to be felt by all. The farmer's pulse thundered in his ears. He had written that desperate email, hoping against all odds that it might prompt even a moment's consideration from someone in power. Yet never had he allowed himself to imagine the Vice President appearing in person. He tried to steady himself, uncertain how he was supposed to respond. Was he meant to walk forward to greet J.D. Vance? Should he wait, letting the visitor make the first move? All he knew was that something fundamental had changed in the blink of an eye. The tides of authority had shifted away from the realtors and those who supported them, and for the first time in weeks, the farmer felt the faint stirrings of genuine hope. Before anyone else could act, one of the Vice President's aides surveyed the small gathering, clipboard in hand, analyzing the scene with keen eyes. Without ceremony, the aide gestured for the group of realtors to identify themselves. The realtors hesitated, conscious that their typical strategy of intimidation or smug dismissal would fail under these circumstances. The local officials, too, looked uneasy, their official badges and seals suddenly small and insignificant in the presence of federal power. J.D. Vance himself approached the farmer, acknowledging him in a manner that combined both formal respect and quiet empathy. There was a moment where the farmer thought he might break down, simply from the overwhelming relief of not feeling entirely alone anymore. But he forced composure, standing with as much dignity as he could muster in his worn boots, determined not to unravel in front of the man who might hold the keys to saving his home. He sensed that the Vice President was there on a mission, not for a mere public relations spectacle, but because he genuinely believed some wrongdoing had taken place that demanded accountability. Whatever conversation transpired next happened mostly through measured gestures and the Vice President's close conferring with his team. Some of the details remained a mystery to the farmer, though he noticed how the staffers produced thick binders and tablets with official seals. He understood from their expressions that they had gathered extensive information on the realtors' practices, the county's perplexing regulations, and the labyrinth of legal obstacles the farmer had been forced to navigate. That they had done so in such a short time was remarkable. Quietly, the farmer thanked whatever cosmic alignment had occurred to bring these people to his doorstep before it was too late. The small cluster of neighbors, standing at a respectful distance, strained to catch any hint of the Vice President's words. They saw the furrow in his brow and the resolute set of his jaw as he scanned the property, taking in the barns, silos, and sprawling fields. On occasion, he would tilt his head toward a staff member, as though confirming a detail or verifying a piece of intelligence. Then his gaze returned to the group of realtors, who hovered in a distinctly defensive posture. It was clear they had not expected this kind of intervention, and they were unprepared for the formal scrutiny that now fell upon them. While the farmer observed in a daze, local law enforcement arrived, summoned by either the realtor's panicked calls or the vice president's team. The officer in charge, visibly unnerved by the presence of such a high-profile visitor, tried to maintain an air of professional decorum. One of the vice president's aides approached him, politely yet firmly requesting the immediate safeguarding of any evidence related to the property dispute. The officer nodded, sensing the gravity of his instructions. Nobody wanted to risk obstruction of federal authorities or appear complicit in wrongdoing. Minutes ticked by, measured only by the tension in the air. Then, in a moment of silent choreography, the vice president's legal advisor stepped forward, clutching an imposing stack of paperwork that bore official stamps and federal markings. The group of realtors, uncertain of how to respond, did their best to project confidence, but one could see them shifting from foot to foot as the advisor began to methodically outline each relevant statute and law, pointing out apparent violations in how the realtors had pursued the seizure of the farm. The advisor seemed especially focused on the broad powers of federal enforcement when evidence of conspiracy, fraud, or corrupt interference with property rights was present. The realtor who appeared to be in charge glanced around anxiously, clearly searching for an escape. He seemed torn between wanting to protest his innocence and recognizing the fruitlessness of such an effort when confronted by the vice president's team. There were no long-winded defenses or attempts to produce contradictory paperwork. It was as if every possible justification or excuse had fled in the face of an authority they had not anticipated encountering. As this dramatic scrutiny unfolded, the farmer felt his heartbeat slow just enough to take in the enormity of what was happening. Only hours earlier, he had been on the verge of handing over his family's land. Now, the same people who had arrived to dispossess him were being forced to account for their actions before the second highest official in the nation. His mind raced with the implications. What exactly would happen next? Would J.D. Vance be able to untangle the layers of corruption at play here, or would this intervention be little more than a symbolic gesture? He glanced over at the local officials, who now seemed painfully aware of the precariousness of their situation. Their eyes darted between the vice president's staff, the realtors, and the cluster of neighbors who witnessed the spectacle. A wave of realization washed across their faces. The old tactics, stalling, intimidation, or hiding behind bureaucratic red tape, would no longer suffice. The vice president's presence suggested that a thorough investigation might ensue, and that any individual complicit in wrongdoing would face serious repercussions. Then, with the measured calm of someone used to high-stakes confrontations, J.D. Vance signaled for the group to gather closer. He did not need to raise his voice to convey authority. Body language and the purposeful way he locked eyes with key individuals made it clear that this matter transcended mere property lines. Over the course of the next several minutes, his legal advisor enumerated the ways in which the realty group had allegedly manipulated local ordinances, colluded with officials to drive up fees and taxes, and utilized predatory practices to acquire farmland at a fraction of its worth. With each pointed reference to a statute or regulation, the realtor's confidence eroded further. The farmer stood by, fighting back the wave of emotion that surged as he realized the scope of what had transpired behind the scenes. Not only had his land been threatened, but it was also likely that he was far from the only person who had suffered such tactics. He now suspected that a chain of unsuspecting farmers and property owners might have faced similar extortion in other counties. The revelations carried a bitter sting, yet they also lent strength to his conviction that shining a bright light on these misdeeds could pave the way for real justice. Aides for the vice president produced documents revealing that a federal inquiry had quietly launched, cross-referencing complaints and property transactions across multiple jurisdictions. The farmer felt his throat tighten when he grasped how perilously close he had come to losing everything before this inquiry gained momentum. The heavy burden he had carried alone for so many weeks now seemed to lift slightly, replaced by an air of vindication. Though the scene had an air of inevitability, it was not devoid of raw emotion. As the advisors and local officials exchanged tense remarks, the farmer could see faint tremors in the hands of the realtors who had wielded such unchecked power only hours earlier. Their entire demeanor shifted from unassailable arrogance to palpable dread, as if they recognized that a single misstep in the presence of the vice president could trigger immediate legal repercussions. Neighbors watched in awe as the vice president's security detail maintained a careful perimeter. Some onlookers fumbled with phones, capturing brief snippets of the unfolding drama. The farmer himself was content to remain an observer, resting in the knowledge that a force beyond his imagination had intervened to hold these individuals accountable. For the first time since the ordeal began, he felt more than just a faint spark of optimism. He felt the growing conviction that justice would prevail. Near midday, when the sun had climbed high and cast short shadows over the farmyard, the proceedings took on a new, decisive tenor. Members of J.D. Vance's staff conferred in low voices, examining documentation provided by local authorities. Though the farmer could not make out every word, he caught phrases like revocation, immediate suspension, and forfeiture of assets. Each phrase sent a fresh jolt of realization through him. This was a reckoning that might lead to lasting consequences for those who had tried to undermine his life's work. He observed how the realtors began to come apart, each one bracing for a personal reckoning. One of them appeared to protest, perhaps trying to shift blame to higher-ups or distance himself from the more egregious tactics, but he quickly fell silent under the unyielding scrutiny of federal officials. Another stood rigidly, as though physically bracing for a blow. It was apparent that the entire enterprise had been orchestrated with the expectation that no one outside the local power structure would care enough to intervene. Yet here they were, confronted by a figure whose authority dwarfed their carefully constructed alliances. After intense deliberations and cross-checking, the vice president's aides began to deliver their findings in a formal manner, referencing evidence of legal violations that included, but were not limited to, illegal collusion and fraudulent conveyance. They clarified that the federal government held the right to revoke certain licenses and seize assets if it was demonstrated that those assets had been acquired or used in the commission of a crime. The realtor's stoic facade cracked visibly upon hearing this. All the effort they had put into orchestrating a seamless takeover of the farmer's land now threatened to backfire spectacularly, jeopardizing not only the business but the personal assets of anyone found complicit. The farmer's mind buzzed with the enormity of the revelation. He had been reduced to desperation, convinced that nothing short of a miracle could save him from losing his ancestral farm. Now, that same crisis was exposing a network of corruption that would have persisted in the shadows if not for his last-ditch plea. He reflected on the nights spent drafting emails, double-checking every word so it might convey his despair accurately, never quite believing his story would matter at such a high level. Yet, unbelievably, it had. He looked on as, one by one, the realtors were compelled to hand over their official licenses and identification. A hush fell upon the gathering as these symbols of their professional standing were taken into custody by federal representatives. There was no shouting or chest beating, only the subdued acceptance that a day of reckoning had arrived. It felt surreal to the farmer, witnessing how a system that had once seemed stacked against him could, in the right circumstances, pivot to deliver justice. Almost as extraordinary was the reversal of fortune that followed. The farmer listened in amazement as a representative from the vice president's office announced that any property or financial gains acquired through fraud, intimidation, or illicit means would be subject to immediate forfeiture. In plain language, it meant that the ill-gotten assets of the realty group, bank accounts, holdings, equipment, could be seized. A portion of those resources, according to certain federal statutes, might then be used to compensate victims of the group's schemes. The farmer stood speechless, trying to process the notion that these unscrupulous people who had come to take his farm could end up forfeiting their own wealth, thus ironically safeguarding his livelihood. As the weight of the revelation spread, the realtors exchanged anguished looks, their once confident posture crumbling under the pressure. A few made feeble attempts to negotiate, but the official stance remained unmoved. It was not a matter of petty vendettas or personal grudges, it was the straightforward application of the law once corruption had been exposed. The prospect of losing everything they had amassed struck each realtor with an unmistakable finality. During these swift and decisive proceedings, J.D. Vance stood by, quietly directing his aides and occasionally conferring with them over small details. He exuded an air of determination that resonated with the fundamental principles of justice and equity. To the farmer, it was as though the vice president was committed not merely to punishing wrongdoing, but to restoring a moral balance that had been absent for far too long. He felt gratitude surge within him, an emotion so profound he struggled to contain it. Curious neighbors began to approach more boldly, forming a loose semicircle around the vice president's group. Some had tears brimming in their eyes, overwhelmed by the realization that someone at the highest tiers of government had chosen to stand with a lone farmer. Others bore expressions of skepticism, as though still trying to convince themselves that this was truly happening. But none could deny that the tide of power had shifted away from the manipulative realtors. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the fields, reflecting in the eyes of those gathered. A subdued but tangible sense of relief seemed to wash over the farmland itself, as if the very soil recognized that it would remain in the hands of those who cherished and respected it. The farmer found himself standing a little taller, feeling a surge of renewed pride. There had been moments during his ordeal when he questioned whether honesty and perseverance had any place in a world dominated by greed. Now, confronted with the vice president's unwavering stance against corruption, he felt his faith in higher principles rekindled. It was not a simple matter of returning the farm to the farmer and calling it a day. The vice president's legal team made it clear that a thorough investigation would continue beyond this initial confrontation. Their immediate task was to halt further predatory actions, safeguard the farmers' rights, and ensure that no legal mechanism remained in place for the realtor group to exploit. Additional steps would involve auditing the county's records, interviewing officials under oath, and collecting whatever testimony was necessary to dismantle the corruption from within. A significant pause elapsed while documents were signed, witnessed, and placed in the custody of federal representatives. The farmer watched the realtors sign one paper after another, each signature seemingly extracting another ounce of their former confidence. They understood now that not only were they losing the chance to seize this farmland, but their entire operation might soon be dismantled under legal scrutiny. Some of them might even face criminal charges, depending on the findings of the ongoing investigation. During this process, the farmer felt a gentle hand on his shoulder. Turning, he realized it was one of the vice president's aides, a person whose face he would forever associate with salvation at the 11th hour. Though the aide spoke in hushed tones, the farmer gleaned that they wanted to reassure him. The federal government would provide temporary legal protections to ensure no sudden local maneuver could be used to sabotage the farm's rightful ownership. They also indicated that an arrangement might be made to offset the exorbitant fees and taxes that had been piled upon him through fraudulent or inflated assessments. He struggled to find a response worthy of such news. Emotion swelled in his chest, gratitude, disbelief, and a quiet, simmering anger at the injustice he had endured all contended for space within him. Ultimately, he could only nod, tears threatening to form at the corners of his eyes. He saw, for the first time in a long while, a glimmer of a future where the farm would remain in his family, preserved and perhaps even strengthened by the trials he had undergone. As the final formalities concluded, J.D. Vance moved closer to the farmer. Even though the vice president's expression was professional, there was a palpable sincerity in his demeanor. He gestured gently toward the wide expanse of fields, as though acknowledging the farm's inherent beauty and importance. The farmer sensed, without the need for explicit words, that the vice president considered this place symbolic of the ideals he hoped to defend, the rights of hard-working citizens, the sanctity of honest enterprise, and the value of heritage passed down through generations. Shadows grew longer across the farmland, a testimony to the passing of an extraordinary day. The realtors, now stripped of their bravado, stood off to one side, speaking in hushed and frantic tones among themselves. The local officials who had aligned with them remained similarly subdued, grappling with the fallout of their questionable alliances. A few neighbors began to step forward, daring to approach the vice president's entourage, likely eager to share their own grievances or simply express their awe at what had transpired. Before long, however, the security team indicated that the vice president needed to depart to address other matters and to formalize the next stages of the investigation from a federal vantage point. The farmer noticed that the aides were careful to collect every relevant document, ensuring that nothing would be left behind for local authorities to bury or lose. The thoroughness of their approach was a testament to the seriousness with which they intended to pursue justice. At last, the farmer found himself standing near the runway of flattened grass where the aircraft had touched down. He felt a rush of wind as the engines roared back to life, kicking up dirt and leaves. J.D. Vance paused at the base of the steps, sharing a knowing look with the man whose life had been upended. No dramatic gestures followed, just a faint, solemn acknowledgement of what had been accomplished. The farmer realized he might not ever have another moment in such close proximity to a national leader, but this one, brief interaction was enough to restore his faith in the idea that those in power could choose to champion the powerless. As the plane lifted off into the late afternoon sky, the farmer remained still, gazing upward until the craft disappeared beyond the horizon. The echoes of the engine gradually receded, replaced by the low rustle of wine through the corn and bean stalks. Slowly, the assembled group dispersed. The realtors found themselves escorted off the property by local law enforcement under the watchful eye of federal agents. The farmer's neighbors drifted closer, each wearing an expression of wonder and lingering excitement. Although an air of finality blanketed the day's events, the farmer recognized that the broader fight was not entirely over. Investigations would continue, testimonies would be gathered, and those responsible for the corruption would face formal charges. But for him, the immediate nightmare had ended. The threat of losing his ancestral home, the place that had shaped his identity and carried generations of family history, had been averted by an intervention that transcended anything he could have orchestrated on his own. As twilight approached, the farmer wandered through his fields, letting the serenity of the land envelop him. For the first time in many weeks, he was not consumed by dread about the coming day. Instead, he felt a sense of resolution, a belief that all his father's toiling and his grandfather's legacy would endure. The stress, the countless sleepless nights, and the sinking pit of despair that had threatened to swallow him whole were now memories rather than present terrors. He reflected on the extraordinary turn of events, almost in disbelief that the email he wrote in desperation was not only received, but acted upon so decisively. He found himself marveling at how a single message could trigger a chain of investigations and lead to the arrival of the vice president himself. He reminded himself of the importance of hope and the audacity to seek help, even when every logical thought suggested there was none to be found. Darkness settled over the property, yet the farmer still roamed, restless with a mixture of relief and anticipation for what the future might hold. He passed the barn, running his hand over the weathered boards that had witnessed countless harvests. He made his way to the small family cemetery plot where generations of his kin rested under simple headstones, the hush of nightfall broken only by distant crickets. Standing there, he spoke silently to the spirits of his ancestors, sensing their quiet pride that the land remained in the family's care. He eventually wandered back to the porch, easing into a worn chair that creaked under his weight. He let the stillness of the evening wash over him, recalling the surreal procession of the day, the realtor's smug arrival, the thunderous approach of the aircraft, the commanding presence of the vice president, and finally, the stunning reversal of fortunes that had left the realtors stripped of their licenses and authority. The memory still carried the faint echo of engines rumbling overhead, a stark reminder that sometimes providence arrives with a roar rather than a whisper. He shut his eyes, letting gratitude flow through him like a steady current. He considered the lessons in these recent trials. He had learned that faith and perseverance do not always guarantee immediate success, but they can create the conditions in which extraordinary assistance may arise. He also acknowledged that corruption does not exist in a vacuum, it survives through complacency and fear. By daring to speak out, even when he believed no one would hear, he had played a pivotal role in exposing a nefarious scheme that reached far beyond his own farm. Tomorrow would bring its own questions, phone calls from federal agents, statements to be given, and paperwork to confirm that his property would be shielded from further predatory attempts. But all that was manageable, far less daunting than the hopeless labyrinth he had been trapped in just days before. With the top levels of government now aware of the corruption, he felt confident that local officials could no longer brush him aside or bury his complaints. In the deep stillness of the summer night, the farm felt alive with renewed possibility. The fields rustled softly, as though relieved to remain untouched by looming development. The homestead windows glowed warmly, promising shelter and stability for the farmer's family and maybe, one day, for future generations. He thought of how close he had come to losing everything, a matter of days, if not hours. Yet by some alignment of courage, persistence, and the compassion of leaders who decided to listen, he had been granted a reprieve. That evening, the farmer slept more peacefully than he had in months, drifting off to the soothing nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs. The weight of dread no longer constrained his breathing, and he allowed himself to dream. Images of bountiful harvests, family celebrations, and a horizon free from dark uncertainty filled his mind. And somewhere, distantly, he imagined the vice president returning to Washington, bearing the story of an unassuming farmer's plight, one that proved that even amid the complexities of modern politics, genuine acts of justice and compassion could still light the way for those in need. When dawn came, a rosy hue spread across the sky, illuminating the fields in gentle pastel shades. The farmer rose from his bed, feeling an unfamiliar sensation of buoyancy in his step. Though the events of the previous day remained fresh, he moved through his morning chores with heightened awareness. Each routine task, collecting eggs, checking the irrigation lines, tending to the livestock, felt blessedly normal, unburdened by the looming specter of confiscation. Just as he began his circuit of the barn, he spotted a vehicle making its way down the gravel path. His heart clenched momentarily. Conditioned as he was to view any new arrival with suspicion. But as it drew nearer, he recognized it as one of the vice president's staff members. Stepping out of the car, the staffer greeted him politely, brandishing an official folder. The farmer's pulse slowed when he saw the staffer's welcoming expression. This was not a confrontation, but rather a continuation of the resolution that had begun. Standing in the glow of the early morning sun, the staffer proceeded to explain that federal authorities had issued an immediate order of protection for the farm. This document formally prevented any foreclosure, lien enforcement, or attempt at seizure while investigations were ongoing. Any further attempts by the Realty Group or their associates to manipulate local institutions would be met with severe legal consequences. The farmer listened, stunned once more by the thoroughness and immediacy with which these measures had been enacted. The staffer also indicated that additional steps would be taken to review the farmer's tax assessments, zoning fees, and other financial burdens that had been artificially inflated. If it was found that local entities colluded with the Realty Group to extort money from him, those funds could be reimbursed or forgiven outright. The farmer found himself leaning against the barn wall for support, the relief flooding him in powerful waves. He recalled how, not long ago, he had found local government offices impenetrable. Requests for hearings were delayed, vital information was withheld, and no one seemed inclined to help him navigate the maze of paperwork. Now he had an entire federal apparatus ready to streamline the process, ensuring that justice would not be obstructed. He felt a profound sense of vindication, tempered by the bittersweet realization that so many others might have endured similar ordeals without such miraculous intervention. The staffer left soon thereafter, promising regular updates as the investigation expanded. Alone again on his land, the farmer lifted his gaze to the horizon, taking in the vastness of the fields that once seemed destined for bulldozers and commercial building foundations. The tenderness he felt for the soil, the structures, and the family memories woven into every acre was more intense than ever. He vowed to take care of this inheritance with renewed devotion. If nothing else, the near disaster had reminded him just how precious his family's legacy truly was. By midday, the farmer noticed a few neighbors venturing onto his property, emboldened by the dramatic turn of events. Some approached him to offer congratulations or apologies for having kept their distance during his ordeal. Others simply wanted to hear, in his own words, the story of how a single email to the vice president had brought a plane roaring onto their local farmland. The farmer greeted them warmly, without bitterness. He understood that fear and uncertainty often kept people silent, and now he cherished their support more than he resented their previous inaction. They discussed how the community itself might rebuild trust and accountability. While some harbored resentment toward the local officials who had been complicit, others expressed cautious optimism that the ongoing federal investigation would shake loose the corruption and deter further misconduct. The farmer listened intently, encouraging his neighbors to stay vigilant. If they uncovered any documents or heard any rumors that might substantiate the wrongdoing, they should share that information with the authorities. As word spread of the vice president's intervention, more and more people started coming forward with their own accounts of suspicious property deals and inflated tax bills. It seemed the farmer was far from alone in the targeting he had endured. The realty group's misdeeds were a central part of a larger pattern, a nest of corruption that thrived on the belief that no one would connect the dots. But with the spotlight now shining on their activities, the entire operation began to crumble like a faulty foundation. In the following days, the farmer's life took on a strange duality. On one hand, he returned to his normal routines, taking care of the crops, ensuring the machinery was in working order, and preparing for the harvest season. On the other hand, he fielded phone calls and visits from federal investigators, each wanting a piece of the puzzle only he could provide. He found himself learning a new vocabulary of legal and bureaucratic terms that had once baffled him. With each new piece of information he shared, he felt the heavy stone of injustice lift further from his chest, replaced by a sense of collective resolve. Despite the disruption, the farmer felt a deep sense of serenity whenever he wandered through the rows of growing plants. He would sometimes pause for long minutes, letting his gaze drift over the green expanse, knowing that each leaf, each blade, stood testament to an unbroken legacy that had been temporarily shaken but was now safeguarded for future generations. In these quiet moments, he also pondered the significance of leadership, how a single individual in power, if truly committed to justice, could decisively alter the course of countless lives. He did not think of J.D. Vance as a superhero. Rather, he saw him as a man who chose action over indifference, who understood that the vice president's office carried not just ceremonial weight but a tangible power to protect everyday citizens when the cause was just. The farmer contemplated writing a letter of thanks, not just another email, but perhaps a handwritten note that conveyed how profoundly grateful he was. Yet every time he sat down to write it, words seemed inadequate, as if they could not fully capture the depth of his appreciation. Nevertheless, he tried. Late in the evening, after finishing his work, he would settle at the worn kitchen table with pen and paper, drafting paragraphs that recounted the events and how they had renewed his faith in the integrity of the nation's institutions. Though it was a slow process, with many scribbled out lines and restarts, it filled him with a kind of humble satisfaction to put these thoughts down, however imperfectly. Outside, a chorus of night insects sang across the fields, a reminder that life continued in its timeless cycles, indifferent to the tumult that had passed. The old house creaked as it cooled in the pleasant air, reassuring the farmer that home was still home. He took comfort in these small routines, cherishing the intangible freedom of going to sleep without the dread of losing everything upon waking. Days slid into weeks, each bringing new tidings of developments in the investigation. More officials were implicated, more questionable deals unearthed, and the once cocky realtors found themselves enmeshed in legal processes that promised severe consequences. Through it all, the farmer cooperated as best he could, occasionally traveling into the county offices to give statements, now welcomed by staff who treated him with a respect he had never before experienced there. The entire balance of power had shifted, and the climate of fear that had allowed corruption to flourish was slowly dissipating under federal oversight. He also received a discreet visit from a representative of the vice president's office, who came bearing official assurances that the inquiry's scope would extend to any other counties where the same realty conglomerate operated. The farmer felt a sense of relief to learn that the law was not stopping with his personal grievances. Though his farm might be the inciting incident, countless others would benefit from the reckoning set into motion. In a thoughtful gesture, the representative also asked if there was anything specific the farmer needed to restore his farm to full functionality, any damage inflicted by the harassment, any neglected infrastructure projects he had put off due to financial strains. At first, the farmer hesitated to ask for anything, feeling uneasy about additional assistance beyond the salvation of his land. But at the representative's gentle urging, he admitted there were certain repairs and upgrades he had been unable to afford. It was suggested that once the ill-gotten assets of the realty group were liquidated, some funds could potentially be directed toward community improvements, including support for farmers who had suffered similar or worse misfortunes. Such news filled him with a cautious optimism. He imagined battered barns being repaired, irrigation systems upgraded, and the general strengthening of rural communities that had long been pushed to the margins of economic progress. Yet he remained humble, knowing that good intentions sometimes got lost in bureaucratic channels. Even so, the mere possibility that so much harm could be transformed into tangible good gave him hope, fueling his determination to see the process through to its conclusion. All the while, he continued to tend to his fields under golden sunsets, mindful of each subtle shift in the weather. He paid closer attention to signs of blight or pest infestation, as though wanting to thank the land for its unwavering loyalty by caring for it better than ever. The farm, with its softly rolling hills and familiar outbuildings, seemed to cradle him in a renewed sense of safety. It bore scars of the recent turmoil, anxiety, stress, sleepless nights, but also stood as a living testament to resilience and the power of moral right. At times, the farmer recalled the expression on the realtors' faces when they realized who was stepping off that plane. The shock, the dawning horror, and the abrupt collapse of their arrogance lingered in his memory as a lesson in the fragile nature of unscrupulous power. He hoped that those involved would come away from this experience with a genuine understanding of the harm they had inflicted and perhaps a resolve to change their ways. It was an optimistic thought, to be sure, but one the farmer felt compelled to entertain. In reflective moments, he also remembered that the vice president, despite the staggering demands on his schedule, had devoted not just bureaucratic attention but personal presence to this cause. The farmer knew that cynics might reduce it to a political stunt or publicity ploy, but he could not deny the authenticity he had witnessed in the vice president's manner. There had been no cameras flashing, no orchestrated media event. It was simply a decisive intervention, carried out with methodical precision. Every now and then, the farmer would catch himself standing in the exact spot where the presidential plane had landed, gazing at the faint tire tracks and impressions left in the grass. He would be hit by a sense of awe and gratitude so strong that his chest tightened. He would close his eyes, reminding himself that none of this was a dream, that the farm remained his, and that the vice president had indeed come in time to rescue him from an impossible situation. As the second phase of this extraordinary chapter in his life wound to a close, the farmer recognized that many formalities still lay ahead. Lawsuits would be filed against the realty conglomerate, local officials would either be replaced or reprimanded, and the legal follow-through could take months or years. But there was no longer an existential threat hovering over his home. He could move through his days with purposeful calm, investing in the soil and the livestock, and perhaps open his doors to neighbors who needed a safe place to discuss their own troubles. Twilight arrived, and he let the day's final rays warm his face as he reflected on all that had transpired since that chaotic morning. He thought of the crowd that had gathered, the swirl of dust and tension, the thunderous approach of the aircraft, and the surreal sight of the vice president stepping onto his farmland. He recalled the hush that followed, the swift and definitive confrontation with the realtors, and the unexpected solace that came from seeing the law act with such clarity and force on behalf of the wronged. In that luminous hour between day and night, with the sky painted in hues of pink and orange, the farmer understood that while the threat had receded, the real victory was the restoration of hope, not only for him but for an entire community. He considered it his duty now to honor this second chance and to guard against complacency. He resolved to stay vigilant against future encroachments, to support neighbors and friends if they found themselves in similar hardships, and to champion a culture of transparency and fairness where it had once been lacking. Breathing in the cool evening air, he felt a profound sense of continuity with the generations who had come before him, those who had broken ground on this farm when fields were still wild, those who had survived droughts and recessions, and those who had passed on the torch of stewardship to him. The land was safe, at least for now, and in that fleeting moment, as he watched the sunset fade into twilight, it felt like the embodiment of every promise he had ever made to his ancestors. He felt a gentle breeze swirl around him, rustling the leaves of the nearby trees and providing a soft, welcoming chorus as night fell. He listened to the rustle with a contented heart, recalling that only weeks ago, every evening had brought despair. Now, the land's gentle symphony seemed to celebrate a reprieve from destruction, a chance to remain under the care of the family that understood its rhythms best. In that quiet, tender interval before the stars fully emerged, he closed his eyes, letting gratitude wash over him like a cool stream, convinced that this extraordinary journey was far from finished, yet unquestionably pointed toward a brighter horizon. He awoke the following morning to a sky brushed with streaks of pale gold, a calm that felt deeper than usual settling over the farmhouse. In the days since the initial clash with the predatory realtors, the farmer had followed a consistent routine of early rises, diligently tending to every chore that helped him stay connected to the land he nearly lost. He found comfort in the mundane tasks, feeding the animals, checking the fences, inspecting the irrigation system for leaks or clogs. The repetitive motions soothed him. Every step through the fields reinforced his gratitude that this precious acreage remained under his care. Yet there were ongoing reminders that his life had been permanently altered. The phone calls from investigators continued steadily, though they had become more focused and less frequent. Officials requested copies of records related to all of the disputed fees and property assessments, and each call brought fresh affirmation that the corruption ran far deeper than initially suspected. It seemed that the realty conglomerate had carved out a wide-reaching empire of manipulated deals, inflated contracts, and orchestrated defaults, leaving a path of ruin in its wake. The authorities, now supported by federal oversight, dug into financial statements and land registers in nearby regions. They discovered patterns of behavior that mirrored precisely what had happened on the farmer's property. For the farmer, these revelations triggered conflicting waves of relief and anger. He felt relief that the scheme was finally exposed but anger that it had flourished unchecked for so long. Despite the tumult, new possibilities arose almost daily. A few weeks after the confrontation on his farm, the farmer was contacted by an organization dedicated to agricultural reform and the protection of family-owned farms. The group had learned of his ordeal and saw it as a catalyst to call attention to the vulnerabilities rural landowners faced in a market saturated with powerful developers. They offered to publicize his story, anonymously if he wished, in newsletters, online forums, and gatherings that included struggling farmers. Initially hesitant, he decided it might help others avert a similar nightmare if he spoke openly about what had transpired. He gathered his thoughts in written statements, describing the bureaucratic entanglements, the intimidation tactics, and the final dramatic day when everything shifted upon the arrival of Vice President J.D. Vance. In the local community, the aftershocks continued. A small group of honest county officials organized open forums to explain what had gone wrong. They explained how certain figures in local government had exploited confusion in land use regulations for personal gain. Some members of the audience vented frustration, having themselves experienced perplexing fees or constant reclassifications of their land. Others expressed a cautious optimism that these revelations might pave the way for meaningful reforms. The farmer attended one such forum, quietly seated in the back. He watched a presenter outline how fraudulent property evaluations had been validated by complicit clerks, eventually leading to legal notices designed to overwhelm unsuspecting landowners. By the end of the evening, the farmer was approached by strangers who recognized him from circulating rumors. They thanked him for persisting, for not giving up when it seemed hopeless, and for inadvertently sparking the larger investigation. He remained humble about these commendations. As he drove home along the darkened roads, illuminated only by the headlights of his truck, he thought about all the farmers who might not have had the wherewithal or even the faintest hope of writing to a national leader. The bitterness of that thought tempered his sense of victory. Though his own crisis had been averted, he knew there were countless others who might have lacked the means or the luck to see justice prevail. It steeled his resolve to cooperate fully in any further investigations or interviews that could shed light on the broader corruption. Meanwhile, the formal inquiry by federal agencies gained momentum. Detectives and auditors traced bank records, cross-checked transaction logs, and examined land deeds from the realty conglomerate's archives. Headlines in regional papers began to appear, referencing a sweeping investigation into fraudulent land acquisitions, sometimes hinting that a single farmer's courageous plea to the vice president had triggered the entire upheaval. While his name was never explicitly published, those in his county recognized the story behind the words. On rare visits into town, the farmer sensed a shift in how people regarded him. Some who had once brushed him off in the corridors of the courthouse now approached him with deferential nods. Others seemed a bit wary, possibly because they feared that any association with the old status quo could be misconstrued as complicity. The realty group, meanwhile, descended into financial and legal turmoil. Licenses and permits were suspended en masse. A wave of civil suits followed, each alleging a different layer of misconduct. The farmer heard through local gossip that several top-level executives had tendered their resignations, likely in an effort to distance themselves from the accumulating scandal. Some mid-level employees, apparently unaware of the scale of corruption, were left bewildered and out of work, casualties of an enterprise built on manipulation. The entire edifice of the conglomerate seemed to be collapsing in slow motion, undone by the precise legal instruments it had once manipulated for profit. Around this time, the farmer received an official-looking letter requesting him to testify before a regional panel overseeing the farmland investigations. He remembered his immediate, visceral discomfort at the sight of another official envelope. For a moment, he felt a pang of anxiety, as though the specter of losing the farm hovered over him again. But upon reading the request thoroughly, he understood that his testimony was merely a formality, intended to document the hardships he had endured and to confirm how the realtors had attempted to strong-arm him. Though the hearing was not strictly mandatory, the investigators believed that his testimony would serve as a potent cornerstone in the broader legal proceedings. Eager to do his part in shutting down any remaining predatory loopholes, he agreed to appear. Preparations for the hearing took place in the midst of everyday farm duties. He juggled consultations with legal counselors, some from the vice president's team, others from local networks, and the tasks of sowing late-season crops and repairing fences battered by recent storms. Each day felt long, yet purposeful, as though he were living two lives in parallel, one as a simple caretaker of the land, another as an unwitting figure at the center of a high-stakes legal drama. When the date of the hearing arrived, he drove to the county's administrative building, carrying thick folders of documents and letters he had received over the years. He wore his best clean shirt, albeit still modest by formal standards, and tried to calm his nerves by focusing on the fact that this time, he was no longer alone or powerless. At the entrance, he passed a small group of onlookers, some of them other property owners facing similar battles. Their eyes followed him with expressions ranging from admiration to apprehension. He felt a knot tighten in his stomach, but reminded himself that the truth was his strongest ally. Inside, the hearing room was bright and crowded, the atmosphere buzzing with tension. A panel of officials had assembled at a long table, with clerks positioned to record every statement. The farmer took a seat, noticing the presence of a few attorneys for the realty conglomerate, who appeared visibly strained. They leafed through binders, avoiding eye contact with anyone else in the room. The moderator introduced the nature of the session, to gather first-hand accounts of questionable property acquisition methods. When the farmer's turn came, he described in plain, methodical detail the initial letters threatening liens, the clandestine surveys on his property, and the tide of bureaucratic obstacles that almost sank him under debt. Throughout his account, he made certain to highlight how the crisis culminated in the extraordinary intervention by the vice president. He felt an odd sense of distance, as though he were narrating someone else's story rather than his own. In that sterile room, his recollection seemed both surreal and sobering. He shared how local officials had become unhelpful or outright obstructive, and how the realtors often arrived in teams, fostering an environment of fear. The panel's members displayed a range of reactions: shock, fascination, and, in some cases, a troubled understanding that the farmer's account matched emerging patterns from other witness statements. Once he finished, a few panel members asked clarifying questions, delving into specifics about dates and names. The farmer answered as thoroughly as his memory allowed. He sensed that the attorneys for the realty group wanted to speak in rebuttal, but they offered no cohesive defense. Their remarks were scattered and feeble, unable to contend with the consistent record of intimidation that had already been corroborated by multiple sources. The hearing concluded for the day with a promise of additional fact-finding sessions, and the farmer departed, feeling drained but relieved. Outside, he was met by a handful of well-wishers. They thanked him in hushed voices, acknowledging the risk he had taken by stepping into such public scrutiny. He responded as graciously as he could, though he was eager to return to the sanctuary of his fields. The more time he spent away from the farm, the more he realized that his true sense of stability and peace lay in the everyday rhythms of tending to the land. He drove back under a midday sky, half expecting to see a wave of official cars behind him. But there was only open road, and that sense of lingering hope he had carried since the moment the vice president had arrived to protect his family's legacy. Over the subsequent weeks, minor victories gathered momentum. Reports circulated that multiple local officials had resigned or been placed on administrative leave while investigators pored over their involvement in the scandal. The county courthouse established a separate review board tasked with revisiting any property disputes that had been flagged as suspicious. Farmers and homeowners alike were invited to submit documentation for reevaluation, potentially recovering unwarranted fees or back taxes. A slow but unmistakable sense of renewal began to spread, as if the entire community was gradually coming to terms with a hard truth and finding a path to redemption. Amid these bureaucratic transformations, the farmer felt increasing pressure from reporters seeking to write in-depth profiles about the case. Some came from local outlets, others from regional or even national publications. He responded carefully, mindful of the ongoing legal processes and wary of overshadowing the collaborative efforts of so many others who had also stood up to the realty conglomerate. He recognized that the vice president's involvement lent his story a certain dramatic flair. But he also insisted that the larger issue, protecting family farms, take precedence over his personal role in the story. In a gesture of cautious outreach, the farmer accepted an invitation to speak at an agricultural conference being hosted in a neighboring county. Organized by a coalition of farm bureaus and advocacy groups, the conference aimed to dissect common threats to family-owned farms, offering legal advice and exploring strategies for collective negotiation. The farmer arrived early on the day of the event, carrying nothing but a well-worn notebook and a handful of reference letters he had received from the vice president's team. The hall was modest, filled with folding chairs, a small stage, and informational booths showcasing everything from sustainable crop rotation to the importance of beekeeping. When it was his turn to address the crowd, he approached the podium with a steady composure he never imagined he would possess. He recounted his experiences in broad strokes, emphasizing the sly nature of how the harassment escalated. He recounted the realtor's polished manners, the maze of unclear regulations, and the abrupt transformation of local officials from friendly civil servants to gatekeepers for hidden agendas. He described the crushing burden of the daily letters threatening legal action, each printed with ominous legal language that left him feeling isolated. Attendees listened closely, many nodding at familiar points. Even those who had never been targeted by corrupt realtors recognized parallels in how institutions could be swayed by money and influence. The farmer spoke candidly about the emotional toll, how he had felt powerless in the face of mounting fees, and how that despair nearly drove him to surrender his birthright. Then he described the moment when he decided to reach out to the vice president's office, fully expecting his message to get lost among thousands of others. As he concluded, he noticed tears in the eyes of a few listeners, perhaps because they had felt the same despair and now realized that it could be overcome. During a break afterward, people approached him in small groups, sharing their own stories or seeking advice. He encouraged them to document every interaction meticulously, to seek help from trusted legal experts or advocacy groups, and, crucially, to remember that isolated farmers were the easiest targets. Working together in alliances, sharing information, and standing up for one another gave small landowners a far better chance of fending off systemic exploitation. Despite his innate modesty, he felt a surge of pride in knowing that his experiences, however harrowing, might help shield others from similar predicaments. In the midst of these new connections and responsibilities, he remained ever devoted to the farm. On warm afternoons, he walked along the edges of his property, observing subtle shifts in the soil and vegetation. He noticed that after a recent rainfall, the creek that snaked through his fields had swelled slightly, promising more abundant irrigation for the crops. His routines became more joyful, even as the demands of legal follow-up and community involvement piled onto his schedule. Occasionally, he would think back to the moment he'd watched the vice president's plane vanish into the sky, reflecting on how that singular event had catalyzed so many changes, not only in his personal fortunes but in the entire region's stance against corruption. Months slipped by, and the farmer received word that part of the forfeited assets from the realty conglomerate were being set aside specifically for the restitution of exploited landowners. He was given the chance to file for reimbursement of the countless fees he had paid under pressure, and a portion of those funds even went toward improvements that enhanced his farm's resilience. This development, reported widely, served as a public demonstration that justice could carry tangible benefits, not merely punishments. The same system that had nearly destroyed him now facilitated resources for him to repair irrigation lines and modernize his storage facilities, modest but meaningful progress that he had once believed impossible. Encouraged by the success of his farmland's recovery, he found himself networking with other farmers, sharing lessons about preserving the integrity of rural land. Some suggested forming a cooperative, pooling resources to resist external pressures and secure fair prices for their produce. Others proposed a series of workshops on legal literacy, ensuring no farmer would remain in the dark when faced with suspicious contracts or hidden clauses. While the farmer felt more comfortable behind a plow than at a negotiating table, he saw merit in these ideas. In the quiet evenings, he wrote down notes for future meetings, determined not to waste the momentum that had arisen from the fiasco. At one point, he received a gracious invitation from staffers associated with the vice president's office, who mentioned that J.D. Vance was scheduled to tour agricultural initiatives in the region. The farmer was invited to attend a small gathering where community leaders would discuss the importance of preserving family farms for national food security. He sensed that his presence might underscore the administration's stance against corruption and highlight the story that had captured so many hearts. Though he felt shy about being in the same room again with high-ranking officials, he recognized this as an extraordinary chance to further advocate for rural issues. On a crisp morning, he traveled to the designated conference center, an unassuming structure near a state university campus. There, he met fellow farmers, local cooperatives, and a blend of state officials. Conversations buzzed around him, people talking about sustainable water usage, advanced soil testing, and the availability of grants for smaller producers. When the vice president arrived with his entourage, the energy in the room shifted. Conversations hushed slightly, replaced by an air of reverence and curiosity. The farmer found himself standing near the back, unsure whether he would be formally acknowledged. Yet within moments, an aide discreetly guided him forward. The group parted, making space. He soon found himself face to face with J.D. Vance once again. The vice president wore the same calm composure that had been evident that pivotal day on the farm, scanning the attendees with a practiced eye that seemed to register every detail. The farmer felt a jolt of recollection, the swirl of dust, the realtor's tense stares, the sudden finality with which their plans had been dismantled. Here, under polished fluorescent lighting, the memory took on a new dimension of surreality. He tried to express his gratitude, but stumbled over how best to summarize the magnitude of what had transpired. Though they did not speak directly, the farmer conveyed his thanks through a quiet, respectful acknowledgement, sensing that the vice president grasped the depth of his sentiment. Observers could see a wordless understanding pass between them, one forged in the crucible of crisis. Later, as the conference proceeded, the farmer and others listened to a discussion led by policy advisors. They highlighted the imperative of protecting smaller farms from predatory development and introduced preliminary ideas for legislation that would provide clearer legal recourse to those facing fraudulent property claims. The farmer noted the thoughtful way J.D. Vance engaged with participants, absorbing their accounts of drought challenges, market volatility, and the threat of powerful corporate interests. He could not help but recall his own experiences, feeling both a sense of continuity with the day the plane landed on his fields and a conviction that this was the broader purpose behind it all, ensuring no farmer would stand alone in future battles. When the event concluded, participants gathered in small clusters, exchanging contact information and forging tentative alliances. The farmer recognized some of the faces, county representatives who had turned over a new leaf, neighbors who had once hesitated to speak out, and newly formed advocacy groups whose mission was to protect regional farmland. He felt pride in seeing them step into more active roles. Perhaps the greatest triumph of the entire ordeal was that it had emboldened ordinary people to recognize the cracks in the system and strive to fix them. Outside in the parking lot, the farmer lingered to greet acquaintances. Despite the chill in the air, a current of optimism seemed to warm everyone present. Vehicles departed one by one until he was left standing by his truck, watching the horizon glow pink against distant hills. He thought of how far his life had come since the shadows of near dispossession darkened his doorstep. With the passing of more months, the once looming legal cases against the realty conglomerate approached their final resolution. Settlement negotiations, criminal indictments, and civil proceedings converged into a definitive reckoning. News outlets announced sweeping penalties, including the permanent revocation of the group's real estate licenses, extensive fines, and in some cases, prison sentences for top executives who had orchestrated the bribery of local officials. The farmer noted that many of the unscrupulous players who had swaggered onto his fields felt the full brunt of these legal outcomes. Some ended up losing their personal assets, a fate that once would have seemed unimaginable to him. He briefly pondered whether he should feel satisfaction or sympathy at their downfall. Ultimately, he concluded that they had reaped the consequences of their willful exploitation. By that point, the farmer's life had settled into a new normal. He continued to manage his fields with diligence, grateful that he never had to let them fall into disuse or neglect. The community around him was no longer paralyzed by hidden deals. Quite a few local processes had been reformed. Property assessments underwent external audits, building permits were issued with transparent guidelines, and the county clerk's office, once a labyrinth of inaccessible documents, made a concerted effort to become user-friendly. It was still far from perfect, but each incremental improvement served as a reminder that change was indeed possible. On an unassuming afternoon, the farmer received a modest check by certified mail, partial reimbursement of the fees he had paid under duress, now returned after the legal proceedings confirmed the wrongdoing. Though the sum was not huge, it represented a tangible moment of closure. He deposited it into the same local bank where, not too long before, he had anxiously inquired about covering mounting debts. This time, he felt a calm sense of security. He decided to allocate some of the funds to repairing a dilapidated storage shed out by the farthest field, turning it into a small workshop for tinkering with new irrigation methods. He also donated a portion to a community fund that supported local farm families in crisis, hoping the gesture would extend the sense of rescue he had once desperately needed. Even as the year turned, bringing new planting seasons and fresh challenges like unpredictable weather and market fluctuations, the farmer carried a profound sense of renewal. On the occasional evening, he would reminisce about the drama that had nearly consumed his life, the creeping dread, the relentless bureaucracy, and the final, breathtaking salvation that arrived in the form of a descending aircraft on his land. Each time he relived those memories, he encountered a wave of relief that nearly overwhelmed him. The ordeal had tested him, forging a new resilience he never expected to possess. He understood that an undercurrent of uncertainty might always run through rural life, shaped by the cyclical nature of crops and volatile markets. But he now had proof that even the greatest injustice could be confronted and good people refused to turn a blind eye. The vice president's intervention, which once felt like an improbable dream, had blossomed into a catalyst for real change across the region. Whenever he felt doubt gnawing at the edges of his thoughts, he recalled that moment when the realtors, ready to finalize their unjust claim, froze in astonishment as a symbol of federal authority touched down on his farmland. He remembered the swirling dust, the stunned silence, and the presence of J.D. Vance, who had seen fit to rescue a single farmer in distress, and in doing so, illuminated a broader network of corruption and injustice. Time passed, marked by the steady rhythms of planting, harvesting, and mending. The farmer occasionally hosted small gatherings at his property, where neighbors discussed best practices for soil health or shared insights on local markets. He reserved one corner of these gatherings for quiet reflection, encouraging participants to remain vigilant toward potential threats, be they environmental, economic, or political. The memory of nearly losing the farm acted as a powerful reminder that complacency could be just as dangerous as outright wrongdoing. Though the farmer never again heard the thunderous roar of a presidential aircraft alighting on his land, he knew that the protective spirit embodied in that moment lingered as an ongoing legacy. Occasionally, he would find himself gazing at the open sky, remembering precisely where the plane had touched down, imagining the purposeful footsteps of officials determined to set things right. In those reflective moments, he felt the convergence of past and future, a blend of gratitude and responsibility. The events he had lived through had not merely returned him to a state of equilibrium, they had propelled him into a more engaged role, a voice for those too often overlooked in remote corners of the country. He was no politician, nor did he aspire to be, but he had become, in his own modest way, a steadfast advocate for the land and the people who worked it. In the hush of another twilight, with the skies shedding the last glimmers of orange and pink, he stood at the edge of his property. A gentle breeze stirred the crops, carrying the scent of fertile earth and the promise of a fair season ahead. He felt a deep peace, anchored in the knowledge that the farm stood secure, guided by hands committed to its well-being. The dim silhouette of his home against the setting sun evoked memories of the many generations who had toiled here before him, each wrestling with their own hardships and challenges. He allowed himself a moment to honor those ancestors, silently thanking them for instilling in him a resilience strong enough to confront a formidable enemy. That resilience had been tested, nearly exhausted, yet ultimately replenished by an act of compassion and bold leadership from realms of power he had once viewed as distant and inaccessible. The farmer now faced his days with renewed determination, fostering not only crops but also a sense of communal solidarity. He knew that many eyes had witnessed the redemption of his land and learned from it. Perhaps this knowledge was the truest form of victory, to realize that one person's trials could inspire a collective willingness to root out corruption and defend the vulnerable. Secure in this conviction, he returned to the farmhouse under the widening night sky, heartened by the certainty that he, and his precious fields, would see the morning light in peace, ready to flourish under a justice hard won and a hope reborn.